Welcome to Woking Up.
White supremacy. White supremacy is the fringe of the fringe.
This is a mini-series brought to you by Polite Conversations.
All of a sudden we can't talk about Neanderthal DNA anymore.
Here I'll talk about my journey into and out of being a new atheist Sam Harris fan.
In and of itself, that video is not evidence of racism.
I'm your ex-Muslim host, Ina. No, not the right-wing kind. Thank you for tuning in.
This is how the left will die.
Wow. Hello. What a crazy start to this year, huh? Insurrections, impeachments, and inaugurations. Oh my. It has been a long January. So, forgive the alliteration, please. Welcome to Woking Up 4. Trump is no longer in the White House, and frankly, that is a relief to me. Yes, of course, there's still loads of problems, and Biden is far from ideal, but he's not Trump, so there is that. As things have been constantly moving and changing, it has taken quite a bit to put this episode together, so apologies if you've been waiting. But to refresh your memories, last time we discussed the post-election roller coaster that Logic Lord Sam Harris was on, in that wonderful IDW quote-unquote retirement, as well as the highly entertaining infighting and such. Well, here we are, once again. All is not well in the IDW sphere. The events of January 6th and the subsequent banning of Trump from social media and impeachment have proven to be quite divisive among the rationals. And Sam, who couldn't have possibly timed this worse, released a half-hour or so episode on some of his thoughts for the new year, where he both-sided wokeness and Trumpism on the evening of January 5th, comparing COVID denial and voter fraud conspiracies to concerns about widespread institutional and systemic racism in the fucking Trump era. Of course, in typical Harris fashion, he put a little caveat at some point and left himself some wiggle room, saying very briefly how they aren't equally bad, of course, but then continued on for much of the episode to keep comparing them as if they very much were two sides of the same coin. And it's not as if that hasn't been a consistent message of his for years now, anyway. In fact, he's often portrayed the left as a much worse threat than the right, because they don't single out Islam enough. Remember when he said he'd vote for Ben Carson over Chomsky? Yeah.
I mean, given a choice between Noam Chomsky and Ben Carson, right, in terms of the totality of their understanding of what's happening now in the world, I would vote for Ben Carson every time. Right? Now, Ben Carson, I think, is a dangerously deluded religious imbecile, right? I mean, Ben Carson does not, the fact that he is even a candidate for the presidency of the United States is a scandal. But at the very least, I think he could be counted on to sort of get this right. Which is to say, he understands that jihadists are the enemies. And yet, we have the masochism on the left that is so totally disempowering in the face of this, and is just eager to destroy the reputation of anyone who will worry out loud about the dynamics of this problem.
So, right in his first episode of this year, he very, very kindly and conveniently and neatly packaged for us just how wrong and dangerous his thinking often is. Over the last half-decade, and long before that too, but especially in these Trumpy years, he has spent the majority of his time, effort, and influence on fear-mongering about the dangers of the left or of wokeness, and constantly downplaying the dangers of the far right. I mean, That is undeniable. Surely even his most dogmatic fans that aren't Trumpers should be able to see that.
It's just, I am worried about a time where, given a choice between the right or the left, when the left is this confused on this topic of really civilizational importance, and given a forced choice between the two, that even otherwise liberal people will be forced to choose the right. And I see that potentially happening in Europe before the U.S., but I could see that happening in the U.S. as well. It's not a matter of becoming more right-wing. It's a matter of, the house is on fire, and the only people who seem aware that flames don't usually belong on the ceiling are members of the right. Okay, so then who are you going to trust to put out the fire? You've got at least one side is talking about fire more or less accurately and acknowledging that it shouldn't be where it currently is. The other side is speaking pure delusion and in many cases reaching for a can of gasoline.
No matter how unhinged and dangerous the right became, his focus was always the left. But yeah, this first episode of Sam's really started the year off with a nice IDW tone. Some feared he might lose that after he handed in his imaginary resignation, but hey, see? There was nothing to worry about after all. He even referred to Eric Weinstein again as his friend and positively referenced one of his idiotic terms too. I mean, who really knows with the unpredictable, volatile, and urgent situation in his country, but I do think this might be typical of what we see in the future from Harris, slipping in and out of IDW mode as is convenient and washing his hands of it, pretending it was never a real thing anyway, at other times when that suits him better. This kind of attempt at having your cake and eating it too is a specialty of Sam's. Contribute for years to the problem. Then, when it's at its boiling point, don't own up to anything, don't acknowledge anything, just slink away quietly with your hands in your pockets and act like it had nothing to do with you. In retrospect especially, you can see just how much shit Sam has shoveled into this horrifying and toxic anti-left political environment that has now bubbled over in the form of a violent insurrection. But despite that, unfortunately, there are still plenty of people tripping over themselves to make excuses for him. The cognitive dissonance you have to recognize that Dave Rubin is shit for going on his hyper anti-wokeness, disgruntled quote-unquote liberal path while also sanitizing the far right, but to not recognize that Sam just has a milder version of those traits, I don't even know how that's possible. I mean, this would explain why Sam has had such a soft spot for Rubin for so bloody long, and was willing to defend him in published pieces and do events with him. I guess it's easier to see through Rubin now that he's a full-on Trumper and anti-masker, but really, do people have to have a bar that low? Does it have to be that blatantly repulsive and far gone for some to recognize the problem? Just look at the urgency of the political climate. It is important, I think, to not lend further credibility to those who've helped bring things to this level. There will be a lot of revisionism in the coming days as people scramble to seem like they were always on the right side, and the IDW has always been the quote-unquote intellectual arm of providing the right's dangerous delusions and conspiracies some legitimacy. Who the fuck do you think was doing events with Ben Shapiro in giant chairs a couple of years ago? Ben Shapiro, who was one of the Quebec mosque shooters' top searched accounts. Ben Shapiro, who is now minimizing the horrifying zip tie guy at the Capitol. Ben Shapiro, who handed his daily action email over to Ted Cruz so he could use that to send mass emails about election fraud conspiracies. This is not just about Trump. It's an entire ecosystem. And the both retired and unretired members of the IDW are very much a part of that ecosystem. Don't forget that. The IDW sphere right now is such an excellent microcosmic parallel to the Republicans. There's the infighting between those who have remained loyal to Trump and those who are jumping ship only now that there's been a violent insurrection, and those who are anti-Trump but still share the same troubling underlying beliefs and have contributed to the problem. Though maybe that's unfair to anti-Trump Republicans, because I feel like they've been better than the IDW, actually, at not both siding or rushing to Trump's defense in roundabout ways. And on that note, I made a little musical tribute to Sam's wonderful, helpful contributions to the discourse. And this is really just a little sampling. I couldn't possibly fit all his wisdom in one single tribute. But here we go. Crank up the volume and dance. Dance your rational little heart out.
It's a thankless job defending Trump or any of these other people who I disagree with more or less across the board. It's a thankless job defending Trump. Many of the attacks on Trump are so poorly targeted that he's being called a racist for things that are not evidence of racism. Again, I'm giving Trump the benefit of the doubt here. They were sick of being called racist for not worrying about Halloween costumes. So millions of these people, along with real racists, told all you whinging social justice warriors at Yale and Brown to go fuck yourselves. And can you really blame them? I mean, safe spaces, trigger warnings, new gender pronouns, whinging social justice warriors, go fuck yourselves. Okay, but that's not the same thing as uttering a dog whistle. The study of hoarding behavior. If someone studies the psychological problem of hoarding and they study the genetics of it, and then they just happen to discover that the genetics are represented differently in different populations, and Ashkenazi Jews, of which half of my ancestry is, have more of the hoarding genes than other people. The hoarding genes. People don't want to hear this. And they certainly don't want to hear that average IQ differs across races and ethnic groups. Average IQ differs across races and ethnic groups. Okay, but that's not the same thing as uttering a dog whistle. White supremacy is still the fringe of the fringe in the United States. I think it's reasonable to worry whether we are witnessing the destruction of Europe right now. And for demographic reasons, you see a few videos of Antifa, you want the far right to show up. And you certainly want the state to clamp down on this kind of behavior. You want the far right to show up. Virtually every Democratic candidate at this point is poised to pander to the wokeness. I mean, honestly, the far left is as concerned about race as the Ku Klux Klan. And yet the problem is the far left is not the fringe. The far left is everywhere now. In academia, in tech, in journalism. Does the killing of George Floyd prove that we have a problem of racism in the United States? Does it even suggest that we have a problem of racism in the United States? The police use more deadly force against white people. It's just the level of political correctness on this issue. The left. Wokeness. The left. Black Lives Matter is many things, but one thing it is the leftist version of Trump. The irretrievably woke on the left. The left is just irredeemable at this point. The left, on the left. Wokeness. And otherwise liberal people will be forced to choose the right. Is anti-Semitism a problem? Well, yeah, it's a problem, but how big a problem is it? Well, in the States, even in the immediate aftermath of a synagogue shooting, it's not that big a problem. And I've acknowledged that his plain talk about radical Islam is preferable to the sanctimonious lies we get out of the Democrats. My problem with the left is that it's finding evidence of racism everywhere. The left, and the left. Wokeness, whinging social justice warriors. Go fuck yourselves. We have to figure out how to heal the divide in our country. But some people listen to this podcast just for the pleasure of quoting me out of context in misleading ways.
Sorry to cut your eargasm short, but we do have a lot to get through. I know. You were really enjoying that pure, distilled rationality poured directly into your brain via this podcast, which is nestled into your ears with the proximity of a mother or a lover. Oh gosh. If you don't get that reference, please go back and listen to the end of Woking Up 3 again. But seriously though, what do you think the effect of all that crap being pumped into millions of people's ears has been? What do you think the political impact of that is? And yes, before someone tries to point it out to me, I am very familiar with his special brand of Trump criticism, thank you. I know, he's anti-Trump, yes. But come on, do you think the impact of all that on impressionable minds has been to create more balanced, nuanced, rational thinkers, or to push people further and further right while making them believe they're becoming more balanced, nuanced, and rational as they transform into the very opposite of that? I wonder. And this little tribute to Sam's geniusness was a broad overview of stuff from the past, but let's be fair and look at a recent sample of his content, when, things were getting more urgent. Surely he cooled his anti-left nonsense then, right? Wrong. This is what he was putting out into the world the night before the storming of the Capitol. You ready? It's time for some both sidesing.
In fact, our society appears to have shattered itself into competing cults. The cult of Trumpism, with its especially crazy core of QAnon, and the cult of wokeness, with its crazy core of critical race theory. I'm not saying these problems are precisely the same or necessarily proportional.
There's that little wiggle room he gives himself to walk it back by saying he did in fact acknowledge they aren't proportional.
But they are the same in being constituted almost entirely by propaganda, to a degree that should only be possible in dystopian fiction. It's like we've come ashore on the proverbial island of liars, and it's just deranging. And all of this seems caused by and further causes a breakdown in social trust and trust in institutions.
But you see, then he goes right back to stressing how he thinks they are in fact similar in being entirely propaganda. Dystopian levels of propaganda. So, not the same, but really the same. They are both responsible for a breakdown of social trust and a breakdown of social institutions. Not like there's an incredibly dangerous problem on the right, which was in power at that moment, that he could have maybe just focused on, given that his country's falling apart, Nope. Both sides sing all the way. This is the kind of thing he'd complain about when there was an Islamist attack and people in that tragic moment would be like, it's so sad what happened, it's terrible, but the Charlie Hebdo cartoons were offensive too, or something.
And yet our most prestigious medical institutions, like the CDC, and our most prestigious medical journals, like the New England Journal of Medicine, have worked extraordinarily hard in the last year to destroy their reputations. The contamination of public health and scientific communication by political dogmatism on both the left and the right has been catastrophic. We've had our most respected medical voices either capitulate to Trump and his messaging or capitulate to the wokeness. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you haven't been paying attention.
Right, because dangerous anti-lockdown lunatics and anti-maskers and government officials disobeying scientific recommendations has been a very both sides thing, especially from his American perspective. You know, Trump saying to drink bleach, government officials downplaying and denying the dangers of the virus, refusing to wear masks, versus the left, talking about how COVID disproportionately affects minorities, how domestic abuse has spiked because of the lockdown. It's basically the same thing, right? Very, very responsible to put this kind of both sidesing out there in such a volatile environment.
Anyways, but whatever you call them, the political extremes have gone mad. Perhaps they were always mad, but the madness has crept inwards and has tainted vast stretches of the mainstream. Mainstream Republicans have capitulated to Trump and Trumpism to a degree that I wouldn't have thought possible. And the ideological capture of the media and our other institutions by wokeness has been just as amazing. One has to reference the behavior of cults to begin to understand what's going on here.
Yes, definitely no other groups that you might want to reference the behavior of cults for. And this whole the media being too woke thing is such a standard Daily Caller, PragerU, and Trumpian talking point, is it not? I mean, it's called progress, Sam. Everything that's moving even slightly forward, he doesn't like, and he wants things to adhere to some decades-old idea of left-wing values that he finds appropriate. Any evolution beyond that is wokeness. And he does this comparison repeatedly and has done it on his show for years. But if anyone says he's both sidesing in this awful, incomparable situation, he has a built-in defense where he, for a minute, said that maybe these things are not necessarily equal in proportion, but the rest of the episode they are compared side by side as if they are, again and again and again. But this one, by far, is my absolute favorite comparison. Check it out.
Do you think there was a massive voter fraud in the 2020 election and Trump actually won? And Republican election officials and secretaries of state and judges are all in on the plot? Well, if you do, you're in a cult. Do you think that racism and sexism and other forms of bigotry are our main problems in society now? And that they explain all current inequality?
Well, some of these things are not like the others. What ridiculous and dangerous comparisons, proven completely wrong just hours later by a violent insurrection. Shameful, embarrassing stuff. If he had any courage or intellectual honesty, he'd revise that and acknowledge he's been wrong. That would be the responsible, respectable thing to do. And bigotry or sexism don't have to be the only or the main problem right now for it to still be a main fucking problem. Imagine denying that in the goddamn Trump and plague era, where clear racial disparities have been shown in the impact of the pandemic and medical care in general. And the effects of the pandemic don't just stop at race either. Let me just read a recent quote from Fortune magazine. Technically, women accounted for more than 111% of jobs lost last month. The U.S. economy lost a net 140,000 jobs in December, the first month since April that total payrolls declined, the Labor Department said Friday. But women lost 156,000 jobs overall during the month, while men gained 16,000 jobs. And if Fortune is too much of a commie, wokeness-infected source for you, that story's been covered by CNN, Business Insider, and CBS, and a bunch of others too. Here's another quote from Forbes, comparing numbers of arrests from BLM protests last summer and the storming of the Capitol. Between May 30th and June 2nd, 2020, the height of the racial justice protests, 427 unrest-related arrests were made in D.C., including 24 juveniles, the police department says. On June 1st alone, more than 5 times the number of people were arrested than on the day the Capitol was stormed, with 289 people booked. How can you be this confidently and consistently wrong? How? And have people continue to give you the benefit of the doubt over and over again. I mean, what, 15 hours later, that podcast episode had already aged terribly. This is a strange time, honestly, to be working on a series like Woken Up, because I imagined I would get to tell the story of my disillusionment in the past tense without needing to keep adding such significant pieces to it almost every time. But Sam's areas of concern and focus have proven to be so colossally wrong and continue to be. His choice in allies and friends so embarrassing that this story still continues to unfold. And so I have to add episodes that I hadn't originally scheduled, addressing some of his recent harmful takes that connect to his past content. Like, seriously, I was not expecting to do an insurrection-related Woking Up episode, but here we are. A couple of times now, I've written a Woking Up episode and had to rejig the entire thing to accommodate some new nonsense he's bestowed upon us. So, it's been wild to keep up with this constantly unraveling IDW drama, the political backdrop, and his incessant galaxy brain takes. I'm kind of regretting doing a series on someone with so many exhaustingly terrible takes now. Anyway, hopefully this will be the last detour from my planned episodes and we can move on and eventually get to the actual postmortem of mine and Sam's conversation. People keep asking me if Woking Up is over. No, it's certainly not. Don't worry. It'll only end once you've heard the postmortem of my previous conversation with him. So there are several more episodes to come. I took a break over the holidays because really, who wants to be clipping this garbage at that time? And I also try to keep my other podcast going, so I did release a Polite Conversations episode in December, and I may, here and there, pause to release one of those. Believe me, I need a break from this project sometimes. It has taken so much of my time and energy and has been so draining. I hate to be a whiner, but each one of these episodes really does take a lot of work. There's a lot of research and tedious re-listening and time-stamping and clipping and editing involved, and all possible because of my wonderful patrons. So if you're hearing this and aren't a patron and would like to support, you can do that via patreon.com/nicemangoes. That reminds me of a funny little side story. I was researching something for this series and stumbled upon an entire thread on Sam Harris's subreddit of his fans calling me a grifter because I have a Patreon and I plug it occasionally. Something nobody else ever does, and Sam Harris certainly never did when he had a Patreon, and not like the extremely rich guy still crowdfunds his podcast or anything. But yep, that's me, the idiot grifter ex-Muslim who gave up the easy route to double or triple my Patreon and my opportunities by talking about Islam, I'm the one who chose to go uphill and speak out against all the people that could help boost my profile as an ex-Muslim. Definitely an excellent grift I'm running. So grifty and sneaky that it's like an anti-grift that caused me to lose Patreon support in proportion to how much I decreased my Islam criticism. And speaking of Patreon, Sam had a funny tweet the other day about cancel culture. One can be strongly against cancel culture and still support the cancellation of dangerous psychopaths. And this came after he'd already tweeted thanking Jack for finally taking Trump off Twitter and saying it was the right thing to do. Being pro-Trump's removal from Twitter is an unusually decent take from Sam, which meant, of course, that it greatly upset the other rationals. Eric Weinstein, Rubin, and other large right-wing atheist accounts were all publicly calling him out, disagreeing with him, which rarely ever happens. So it was amusing to watch. And they all threw these idiotic, slippery slope arguments at him that he himself usually makes in these situations. I mean, the irony of Sam getting grilled by his own crew for this was absolutely glorious. Sam, the guy who once threatened to quit Patreon over Lauren Southern being deplatformed because she was firing flare guns at migrant rescue boats. The Sam who has defended Milo and Tommy Robinson when they were taken off social media. The Sam who did finally quit Patreon when Sargon of Akkad got kicked off for saying the N-word on YouTube. You know, the lovely fellow who once said, "I wouldn't even rape you," to politician Jess Phillips. Definitely the kind of guy who you'd need to take a principled stance for and make a show of. That guy who took that stance was now being widely mocked by the anti-SJW free speech warriors he has surrounded himself with. One response to Sam was something like, "Oh, I'm just waiting for him to rip the mask off and reveal he was Alyssa Milano the whole time." Just a beautiful sight. Please subscribe via patreon.com/nicemangoes to hear the full episode. By supporting on Patreon, you'll get access to all Patreon exclusive content, including Woking Up and early releases of Polite Conversations too, as well as special patron events like AMAs and Skype chats. If you enjoy the show, do consider supporting, because without listeners like you, deep dive content like this isn't possible.